Hello and welcome to the YouTube podcast series of Citiesabc with Open Business Council, Fashion ABC and Dennis Guala. I'm Hilton Supra, the Vice Chairman of Studium Group. Today I'm interviewing Stuart McLachlan, who co-authors The Adventure of Sustainable Performance, where we interview people who are changing the world, people who are inspiring us with their achievements and creativity, acumen with the use of technology. And in previous interviews, Dennis Guala and I have interviewed over 250 amazing people, achieved more than 14 million views on YouTube. This interview series on Citiesabc is in partnership with our platforms openbusinesscouncil.org, a Web3 4IR-based platform utilizing technologies that employ the use of truth and trust through a unique corporate digital identity using blockchain and the deployment of data analytics, AI, and machine learning. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Stuart McLachlan. Welcome, Stuart, and your book that you've just written, The Adventure of Sustainable Performance.
Hi, Hilton. Good to be here.
I'm really excited to hear about the elements that got you to where you are today. You've had an illustrious career working in the environment of ESG and sustainability. But tell us a little bit more about your past in terms of, so where were you born, where were you educated, and what interested you in sustainability?
Yeah, sure. So I was born in a place called Watford, which is just north of London, and I went to school near there. My mother came from an agricultural family. They were farmers on Exmoor, and we used to go to Exmoor for just about every holiday through to the age of 18. So I suppose I always took an interest really in nature and what was going on in the countryside. But I then went to a college which was then called Oxford Polytechnic, now Oxford Brookes University, to study environmental biology. So that was a bit of a passion of mine. I always remember the first lecture that we had where the head of faculty came to see all of us and said, hey, it's great to have you on the course, but I need to tell you that there are no jobs in this arena. So if you want a job associated with the subject of your degree, then you should change courses now. But anyway, I just thought, well, it was an interesting place for me to be for 3 years. So I stuck it out, and actually by the end of the 1980s, which is when I graduated, I then went on to Brunel University to do a master's in environmental pollution science. But by the end of the 1980s, then a lot of people were already talking about climate change and sustainability, what we now call ESG. In fact, I remember a speech that was given by Margaret Thatcher in 1989 to the United Nations the day before the Berlin Wall came down, where she was saying the climate science is real and the world needs to decarbonize. So it's just a reminder of how long the world has been recognizing the reality associated with this crisis, and how long we've been talking about the need to make changes.
And following on from that, when did you start you mentioned before there were no jobs in this area. So what was your first step into the commercial world once you left Brunel?
Yeah, so I at that time, I would say the last 30 years have been characterized by sort of three main market opportunities. In the early 90s, we started to see the arrival of some new legislation that drove a market, mainly around cleaning up the legacy of the past. And so then you saw the emergence of organizations which were typically referred to as environmental consultancies. And organizations were recognizing that the new legislation meant that the polluter pays. So if you could trace the active pollution back to a polluter, then typically you would get those polluters to pay for that historical pollution and that legacy liability. If you couldn't trace it back, then whoever then became the owner of the land then became liable. And of course, that then drove a new marketplace, especially in the United States and the UK, and then we saw similar legislation arrive in different parts of the world, and so we really sort of lent into that as an opportunity, and so I was doing that kind of work. I was doing environmental impact assessments, health and safety work, and then in 1995 I was asked to set up a business in and a UK PLC, a PLC called WSP, and to start an environmental consultancy, which was focused then predominantly on the property sector, which is where the market was. So I grabbed that and then grew that through the next sort of 17 years to a business that became very global. It was a specialist in what it did. As part of this PLC in 2006, I joined the PLC board. So I had then 6 years of experience on the board of a public company, and it grew to about 8,500 people. And at that point, it merged with a Canadian company, retained the same name, WSP, and so it still exists now. Mm-hmm. And it is many tens of thousands of people. An incredible journey.
Mm-hmm. And from there onwards, you started your own firm. What is it? Anthesis Group?
It's Anthesis. It's Anthesis Group. Anthesis is a botanical term, and it is a word that is described in botany as the stage of the life cycle of a plant just before it's going to be move into its most productive phase. So when we set up Anthesis in 2013, we felt that was a nice sort of metaphor, if you like, in terms of where we felt the market was. Mm-hmm. And still the world hadn't woken up to the reality of this climate crisis that we're in at the moment, but it was obviously hotting up. And I guess that, in many ways we were sort of born out of frustration because we were doing all this work in terms of cleaning up the legacy of the past and helping organizations do the right thing today. But we felt that it was just a blind spot in terms of organizations preparing for what was clearly going to be a much more unpredictable future, driven by unsustainable use of resources, driven by the climate crisis, driven by a broken partnership with nature, and so on. So we really just wanted to sort of lean into that opportunity and to, with a blank sheet of paper, try to piece together what we thought would be the ideal company to be able to support organizations when the world woke up to the reality of what was going on.
Did you feel that in the work that you were doing in terms of ESG and sustainability with major corporations at that time, they were just basically running up the flag and saying, yes, we're working on it, but they weren't actually getting their hands dirty and doing something about it? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, look, I mean, there were some pioneers, so we should call them out. And organisations like Unilever and Marks and Spencers and others, they were very forward thinking. But we felt that the agenda was very much on the periphery, and it's only relatively recently that it seems to have gone mainstream. And as we look back, we would consider that most organizations and most leaders of those organizations were creating a bit of a fantasy zone in which to move their stakeholders, where they were trying to convince their stakeholders that either they don't have to worry about it because the climate science is not real. So that's what we call climate denial. Or you don't have to worry about it because we're doing some great things. And they would roll out some stories of some kind of climate mitigation they were doing, but it was all fairly superficial. And typically, leaders were throwing money at their CSR or sustainability departments, saying, "Hey, give us some good news stories and kind of take this agenda away from us so that we can get back to the status quo and business as usual." And so, that has persisted for a long time, and we've heard the similar kind of stories back from when, Margaret Thatcher was calling out the reality of the climate science. I would say all the way through to 4 or 5 years ago. And then for whatever reason, a lot of people say Blue Planet, other people say the arrival of new regulations, other people say, maybe it was the pandemic that made people wake up to the reality that crises can actually happen. And that, the answer and the solution to these kind of crises might be with the scientific community. So maybe we should respect scientists a little bit more. then all of a sudden it was a tipping point, and that's really the point at which all these kind of, whether you call it sustainability or ESG or climate, it went mainstream.
I mean, in terms of the motivations for corporates to do that, number one, it was appeasing their clients, that they were doing something towards that, or that some form of legislation was coming on the rise and they had to do something about that. Or thirdly, it was just a PR exercise. At what point do you see that shift change, where it moves from a cost center to a profit center within businesses?
And of course, there's still examples of corporations that are right across the spectrum in terms of those that are just sort of playing with it and hoping that actually this is just going to be there's just a cost of compliance to this, and we'll cut a check and we'll get back to BAU. But increasingly, we see organizations recognizing that sustainability is now aligned with the core drivers of business value. So employees are voting with their feet. So if they don't like the purpose of the organization, or they don't have shared values of that organization, then they'll go and work elsewhere. We see lots of research supporting the fact that consumer behavior, buying habits are changing. And so consumers are now making purchasing decisions based upon the sustainability performance of products. And we see institutional investors who are now deploying capital towards high ESG performing investments. And some of that is starting to get enshrined much more now in regulations such as the SFDR regulations that we have now within the financial communities within Europe. So I think that if we look at the sort of primary stakeholders that are relevant for business, then business leaders now think, hey, this is now relevant in terms of my market share. This is relevant in terms of the operational efficiency. When I look at the costs of energy, water, waste, and so on, it is relevant in terms of the resilience of my supply chains, or the brand value that all the intangibles. And we mustn't forget the weighting that businesses have towards intangible value. And so brands are under pressure because of this agenda. And then of course we also have the big stick of compliance. So a lot of organizations now are drinking from the regulatory fire hose and trying to get their heads around how they can navigate the regulatory landscape that is now upon them.
In terms of the expertise that you bring to the table, obviously you have to start somewhere when you're having your conversations with these organizations in their sort of transformative journey towards decarbonization and sustainability. And so through the Anthesis Group, you've looked at quite a few firms. Did these firms come to you saying, oh my God, we've got a problem, we really need help, we don't know what we're doing, or we know what we need to do, but we don't know how to do it? So what are the foundations and the motivations that some of these companies have in terms of working with you?
Yeah. So, I mean, to put some context on that, we do about 4,500 projects a year for about 3,500 different clients in over 40 countries. So, we are building up a lot of experience in terms of what works and doesn't work. But the big picture is that, we believe that the models and systems of the old era that was designed at the end of the Second World War, they're starting to break down. In fact, those modern systems have been broken for quite some time, but we found a way to operate within them. They're now starting to break down, and the world recognizes that it has to go on a journey. It has to step out of those, what we call in the book, strongholds. And those strongholds might be, the fossil fuel sector, which is reported to have made $3 billion worth of profit per day for the last 50 years. That's an incredible stronghold. And many of the world's leading economies, many of our pension plans are linked to that particular stronghold. So you can understand why the natural instinct is for leaders to try to put their efforts into shoring up the walls of the stronghold rather than actually come out of that stronghold and take the assets that are valuable on a journey into the transition zone and leave the stranded assets behind. This is a time of extraordinary disruptive change. But what we're saying is that time has arrived because you don't have the option to stay within the strongholds, to stay within the models and systems of the old era, partly for the reasons I just talked about in terms of business drivers, but also because the kind of compliance drivers that we're seeing at the moment is not the kind of compliance that we've seen so often over the last how many decades, which demands incremental nudges in improvement. This kind of compliance is the big stick that says, get out of your strongholds. We have got to move out of these models because we are in an existential crisis. And you have to step into this journey, into this place that we call the transition zone. And who knows how long that transition will last, because the first thing you've got to do is you've got to survive the regulation and the compliance. But in parallel with that, or on the other side of that, there is an incredible opportunity for value creation. And we need the spirit of enterprise, we need innovation, we need entrepreneurialism, we need all those kind of qualities that we typically see within business. That agility to be able to really help us to be able to sort of navigate this time of extraordinary disruption through the transition zone to a place where we can start to reimagine and redesign the next era. And so you asked, well, what is the sort of purpose and role of Anthesis? We see ourselves as guides. And if you rock up a base camp of Everest, you don't actually want a guide that just comes with a consultancy report and says, "Yeah, have a read of that and good luck." You want a guide who's gonna come to you with the expertise, with the experience, because they've been ahead of you and they know what it looks like, with the oxygen tanks, with the ropes, with the right equipment, the right assets. So that's what we pieced together over the last 10 years in Anthesis. Yes, we've got amazing experts, and we've got the experts that can think strategically and advise the C-suite, but we like to ground everything in science. We think that's essential. So we've got the deep technical expertise, but we've got the digital assets, and we've got carbon projects and offsetting opportunities and all those kind of things that need to come together to support our clients to find the right solutions as they navigate this place that we call transition zone.
I mean, it's a real challenge for the very large organizations. I mean, a very big petroleum company based just across the water in Benelux, having conversations with them, because I was dealing with their pension fund at the time. And they were actually starting to integrate the conversation and also the policies and the strategic view of, we need to embrace some sustainability. Yes, we are a carbon company, but we need to start thinking ahead. We need to start, and it was started as a PR narrative, which then morphed into setting up specific tasks groups, putting a director on the board who's in charge of moving towards sustainability and putting a lot of money towards that. But it took a long time for them to become recognized of having some sustainability direction within the company, at the same time still going out prospecting and finding new fossil fuels, and trying to manage perception, reality, view was a major challenge for them. And they had the resources to do it, whereas smaller companies don't have the resources at the time.
Yeah, and there are some more progressive fossil fuel companies and less progressive ones. But what we are not, and what we do not believe in, is to be too shouty towards, for example, fossil fuel companies. We could look at other sectors as well, but if we just look at fossil fuel, because fossil fuel companies have got extraordinary resources, they've got amazing expertise, they've got the kind of engineers that we need to be able to redesign the energy system for the next era.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot that we don't know in terms of what the next era is going to look like, but we know that we need energy. And so, we have a choice. We can either go to where leaders are today and to help them and support them into the transition zone to make the journey, to help them understand which of their assets are actually stranded and which have got value and need to be stewarded, and to really help them to help the world to redesign the energy system that is in partnership with nature and that operates within planetary boundaries and could create a stable climate. So, we like to go alongside them and help them on that journey. There are many other organizations that prefer just to shout and to litigate. Mm-hmm. I understand that, and I understand the desperation that people feel. I think the risk of doing that, though, is that it will force them back into their strongholds rather than encourage them into where we want them to be, which is to become active and progressive in the journey that we need the whole world to make.
I mean, smaller companies tend to be much more agile. And of course, sure. Agile companies tend to be the pioneers in terms of that whole digital transformation sure. journey and sustainable future development. How do you tackle the issue of a very large, well-known corporate who's got massive stake in the position that they're in, moving towards sustainability? It's like a sort of steering a super tanker versus a powerboat. How do you deal with that in terms of the work that you do with them? How do you guide them through that process?
Yeah, exactly. So, there's a number of things at play here. So, for example, what you would have heard a lot of companies saying is they're committing to net zero targets, mm-hmm. And there are two routes to get them to net zero. One is to find greater efficiencies, and that is sort of more of a sort of incremental approach, but it's the law of diminishing returns. And a lot of large corporations are in that place at the moment, and they're thinking, hey, this is not too bad, because the returns that we're getting from energy efficiency with energy prices the way they've been over the last couple of years, why don't we do this anyway, even if we didn't have the drive of net zero? But as I say, law of diminishing returns, and actually for them to be able to get to net zero, they need to be looking at far greater innovation and transformational change, which means changing the business model. So one of the ones that's talked about a lot is how you move from linear business models to circular business models. Linear being, take stuff out of the ground, make stuff, sell it, throw it away. Which is the business model that 99.99% of businesses around the world still operate in. And circular business models is when you effectively get the product back at end of life, or maybe there will be no end of life in the future, because you effectively keep the resources spinning around within a process or within a model of reuse, repurpose, recycle, resell, and so on. So for a large organization looking at that, again, this will be driven by legislation because we see that regulation coming down the pipe. So mm-hmm. they won't get a choice. It would be very difficult for organizations to meet their net zero targets without moving from a linear to a circular business model. Because to be able to meet your net zero targets, you've got to take all your stakeholders with you. So, for example, all your supply chain. So we work for a lot of companies in terms of setting net zero targets and developing the strategy and to make sure that we're measuring their emissions and setting our commitments and so on. And then it gets to the point there to say, okay, we've done what is called scope 1 and 2, which are their direct emissions. Now we've got to get into what the world refers to as scope 3, which is we've got to take all our suppliers and we've got to take all our customers with us. And we've got to measure the climate impact of our products, and we've got to measure the climate impact of our supply chain. We've got 20,000 suppliers and we've got 50,000 customers. How do we do that? So this is this sort of pivot point where everything now starts to scale. And I think what's really interesting for large organizations, and we are working with some particularly progressive ones, but what is interesting, what is challenging is that if you look at the way organizations have typically worked in the past, you've got this sort of corporate stronghold, if we use that word again, and supply chains and customers are externalities. So the way you treat your supply chain is you use your buyer leverage over your supplier leverage. More yield, lower cost year on year. And, if you don't give that to us, then there's plenty of other competitors out there that we can go to. And that's the way it's worked. And now all of a sudden, to be able to meet these sustainability, ESG, net zero, whatever you want to call them, targets, that now they've got to get their arms around the total value system. And the more progressive businesses are seeing that now as a business ecosystem, not a linear business model where you try to create as much wealth as you can within the corporate stronghold and then keep as much as you can external and then leverage your power against those externalities, including nature, interestingly. And so we're now seeing that sort of realization starting to dawn, and this is where leaders are now saying, okay, first of all, we've got to lead in a different way because we've got to lead in a much more pioneering way because we're going on a journey. We've got to see our businesses as ecosystems. We've got to engage with our stakeholders much more broadly. We've got to get our arms around the full value system. And we've got to have a different kind of governance in place within the organization. And that might mean that they need different leadership teams. They're going to have to test the organizational will to be able to go on this journey and to take all their stakeholders with them. So there's a lot of things that you can do right up front to sort of test the sort of readiness and the capability of organizations to be able to step into this adventure, as we call it. Hence the reason for the book.
I mean, before we get on to the book, I just wanted to ask one question in terms of, in order to deliver this level of change from the linear to the circular economy and towards sustainability and embracing your whole supply chain, how much does technology, or is technology going to have to play in actually delivering on those promises?
Massively. I mean, there are so many positive and negative reports that we're reading at the moment about AI. But what I've just described is a much more complex system than the world has been accustomed to over the last 80 years. And I understand why the world has actually done very well in some of the economic systems that were designed 80 years ago. And it would be very difficult, I think, to operate in this way with all your stakeholders as a business ecosystem with all the complexity of that if we didn't have the processing power that we've got today. But the reality is that technology, AI, is going to really turbocharge our ability to be able to operate in this kind of way that we need to be able to navigate the transition. And to put it in context, we could use so many different examples, but let's say you are a manufacturer or a retailer of white goods. You need to know where your washing machine is ending up. You've got to stay in touch with your customer. What is the technology you are going to use to be able to monitor remotely how efficiently that washing machine is working? How do you have a different relationship with the customer to be able to get in touch with the customer and say, hey, your washing machine is operating very inefficiently. It's using too much energy. Can we come and service it? How do you keep in touch with the customer to inform them when it is at the end of its use? I'm not going to say end of life, because it's not end of life, but at a point at which you really need to take that washing machine back to repurpose it and to replace it with another washing machine. These are great business opportunities because, of course, it allows organizations to have a much stickier relationship with their customers. But it's all down to technology, the ability to be able to do these kind of things that we're describing.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote a book with Dean, where you describe in the book this adventurous journey, which is going to be sort of uncomfortable at times, where the new and the cold reality is dawning in a period when the world will continue to play, a denial or talk more of ruins, where the book helps us in terms of looking at foundations and to identify how new systems can be realized. Can you talk us a little bit through about the motivation for writing the book and what reception you've had to it?
Yeah, I think that I watched Shawshank Redemption again the other day with my boy, and it reminded me of how sort of ghastly the film takes on this journey through this kind of horror of life in the prison, all the way out the other side to a place of hope. And I think that we felt that the landscape that we're in. I mean, we're very impact driven, and we really want to be able to sort of move the dial in a positive direction. And we believe that we refer in the book to this decisive decade. So this 10 years that we're in at the moment, the way we respond to this agenda in this 10 years will determine what happens over the next 1,000 years. And so it's an important point for us because we've been in this world for 30 years. So we believe that we've got quite a lot to offer in terms of our experiences and the kind of inspiration that we get from some of our clients. We wanted to share that. And we also, through what we've done at Anthesis, we felt that we had pieced something together that allowed us to do something that was more meaningful and that was of value to organizations. And so we wanted to share that, and we wanted to try to amplify the impact that we can make. Mm-hmm. And so that was, if you like, the sort of main motivation for the book. But I think also we just felt that our world is so characterized now by lots and lots of shouty people, lots of people who feel paralyzed. They don't know how to move. Increasingly, we're finding people who were saying, actually, we really want to do something meaningful, but we don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And we felt that actually, if you look beyond the reality of the existential crisis, and I understand why that is scary, but if you look beyond that, there are opportunities to be excited. There are opportunities to be hopeful. And so we want to take the readers on the journey. And so we started with sort of rooting it in the reality of now. Okay, so because we don't want to dance over the severity of the situation we're in at the moment. Mm-hmm. But once you're beyond that, then we start to sort of come back and say, well, actually, there's a real excitement in this journey. There are things that we can do. It's full of opportunities. Here's a load of examples, from lots of different sectors. We really hope that resonates. There are examples that will resonate with you, the reader. aimed at business leaders, some business leaders who really haven't embraced this agenda before, but also those that are much more sort of progressive in terms of people who have been working with this agenda for a few years. So we try to sort of cover that cohort, but it's for business leaders. It's not for sustainability professionals. And try to write something that we felt would be encouraging, that would also sort of lean into what we understand, because we are business leaders, we understand are the primary sort of drivers for business, where people see that opportunity of value creation. They don't just see it as, as I said before, drinking from this sort of regulatory fire hose, and I don't know where it'll all end.
I mean, it's very interesting that critiques of the sort of the net zero 2050 or 2030, no more fossil fuel cars will be sold, et cetera, and then there are obviously the replacements are hybridized versions of that or full electric. But if any of us who are business leaders can pick up a spreadsheet and say, okay, in order for us to move to electric vehicles, and the number of electric vehicles in say even in the UK multiplied by the amount of the journeys that they're going to make and the charging points that are required in order to facilitate the charging of these vehicles, the national grid wouldn't be able to cope with that massive transition, for example. And also, we talk about people shouting about protecting their interests. Hydrogen fuel cells have completely been pushed to the sidelines, where they have great application in industry, great application in public transport and things like that. So there's a lot of stakeholders that are, as you say, shouty, because they're either self-preservation, self-protection, or they really voicing something that's we can't really attain those goals because we don't have the infrastructure in place to achieve it.
Yeah, look, I mean, what we are going to continue to see in the transition, and probably in the next year, I should imagine, is capitalism. It might be a different form of capitalism, but there will still be supply and demand dynamics. I'm sure we'll still see the existence of free markets. I think the question is whether we bring things more into balance. At the moment, we are used to living in a society that extracts value much more quickly than it creates value, and that is the way the last how many decades will be characterized. So I think that might come back into balance, but I think that we shouldn't underestimate the supply and demand dynamics, where there will be such a high demand for renewable clean energy, and the market tends to become incredibly powerful and innovative in terms of the way it responds to those kind of demand pressures. So I don't think we should rule out the potential for the power grids and the infrastructure to be able to support the embracing of electric vehicles. I know there's a lot of people sort of putting those messages out, but I'm not sure that is assured in any way. We also continue to see behind the scenes, although I appreciate the profile is much lower, investment in hydrogen. And for bigger vehicles, I should imagine hydrogen is being looked at as potentially the more likely solution. We see investment in small-scale nuclear, which I know is it's politically challenging, but at the sort of for city-level power generation, that represents a potential option. Whether it's an option for the transition or whether it's an option for the next era is, I think we'll see some solutions a bit like we saw in the pandemic. It's like lockdown and furlough were crisis responses. Nobody's going to argue that furlough is the right economic model for the long term. But it was arguably, big debate, I know, don't want to wade into that, but arguably it was a relevant economic model for the crisis. Lockdown was put in place because we had to alleviate the pressure from our health systems. We will see, I believe, other crisis-led responses to alleviate the pressure from our planetary system during this transition zone. So we're going to see some technologies that are imposed upon us very rapidly. Some of them we might not like, in the same way as a lot of people didn't like lockdown, a lot of people didn't like furlough.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that everything is against the backdrop of a crisis that is likely to be much more significant than what we experienced, for example, in the pandemic.
I mean, turning to forward thinking, I mean, you're a great visionary. You've done some exceptional work. The book is great. I recommend that entrepreneurs sit down and read it. It is tough. It does talk straight, which I do appreciate. But if you want to sort of look forward, okay, you've seen a lot of motivation for change, whether it's a stick and carrot or whatever. But looking forward to 10, 15, 20 years, particularly when you're talking to your son. You mentioned your son the other day when you were talking, when you saw the film. You thinking of your son, what's his future going to be like? Do you have a very positive view of what the future is going to look like? And could you share that with us?
I mean, it's interesting. I was chatting to my son the other day, and I said to him, it really upsets me to hear that his generation, he's 15 years old, and we read so much about his generation being uncertain about the future and not having enough hope. And I said, I think it's quite the opposite. I think it's quite the opposite, that actually people of my generation have had to operate in broken models and systems for the last 20, 30 years. And we've had to do our best within those broken models and systems. His generation has got the opportunity to redesign and reimagine those models and systems for the next era. These moments in history don't happen very often. I mean, this one's happened quite quickly because it's only been, the last year was only 80 years, and incredible things have happened over those 80 years. I don't want to belittle that, but if you go back further in history, if you look at the end of the slave trade, that was at the end of an era that lasted about 200 years. It's very unusual to be alive during these, what we call this sort of liminal space, which is this time when one era ends before another era starts. And they are special moments because this is the time that, the next era is going to be designed. And so my son's generation has got the opportunity to learn from our mistakes and to get it right next time. And I just hope that instead of that generation seeing the ruins and everything you read, in terms of in the media and social media and on the TV, we talk about ruins. But I think that we should start to see beyond the ruins to foundations. And I think it's incumbent on the business community that tends to be rich with visionaries and entrepreneurs to be able to see the opportunity that exists to build on those foundations.
Good. On that visionary and very positive note, it's been a delightful hour, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Taking us on this journey.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great pleasure.
Thank you for viewing and engaging with today's podcast. If you're interested in knowing more about citiesabc.com, with openbusinesscouncil.org and fashionabc.org, do go to our platforms, as well as you can find me, Hilton Supra, on social media. So direct message me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And do go to the other interviews we have done on YouTube. And don't forget to like and comment. So thank you very much for your time and engaging with this interview on Cities ABC.